what we've got in Westminster is that power imbalance that I said earlier, where people feel that they are untouchable, where they can do things that in any other walk of life, in any other workplace, would be unacceptable.
Luke Pollard joins us, the Shadow Minister for the Armed Forces. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
We'll consider defence spending in a bit more detail as we go along through our conversation. I do just want to start with the political events of the last, 48 hours or so. Of course, regarding Mr Pincher, he's still MP. He's had the whip removed from the Conservative Party and has indeed stood down as Deputy Whip. I do just wonder, we heard from one of your colleagues on the programme yesterday about kind of immediate reaction to that, but I wonder if we broaden the conversation out to standards, processes, protocol, and fundamentally safety of Parliament, where you stand on that. Is Parliament a good, nice, safe place to be?
I don't think Parliament is a safe place for many people to work at the moment, and it should be. Westminster really should embody the very best of British values. It should be a place that young people aspire to work in, that politicians compete competitively to represent their communities in, knowing that it's safe and decent with high standards of public life. And I'm afraid not just over the past year where we've had 5 Conservative MPs accused of sexual misconduct, but over the past few years where the standards in public life have been so thoroughly trashed. This doesn't have to be this way. These are political choices that are being made to allow this toxic culture to fester. And I want to see it cleared out. I want us to drain the swamp. I want us to set high standards for behaviour. And I want us to rigorously enforce those to make Parliament a safe place for everyone. And it's clearly not at the moment. And that's why things need to change.
Yeah, of course. And, it's interesting that, first of all, that you invoke the language of President Trump in terms of draining the swamp. That's the first kind of observation I'd make there. But then also, I suppose in considering what you ask for, I'm not sure you'd find anyone who would disagree with you that standards need to improve, that behaviour needs to improve, that Parliament should be a safe place for people to work. I think anyone who disagrees with that would be roundly ridiculed, and understandably so. So with that in mind, Mr Pollard, what have you done to make Parliament a safer place?
Well, I made sure that we have every single one in my team, including myself, have been on Parliament's ethical training, which is called Valuing Everyone. We've made sure that if any complaints about misconduct are heard by I haven't had any in my team, but for others, that there's a safe route for people to go for. I've voted in favour of measures to do that. But, I mean, the workplace at the moment isn't what it should be, because it's fine having rules and protocols in place. And, we've got many of those now, after a long struggle to get them, it's worth saying. But we need to have them led from the top. You need to have them supported and endorsed. And sadly, what we've seen over the last 24 hours is Downing Street try to shut down this situation with Chris Pincher by saying that the matter was closed when it clearly wasn't. The whip has now been withdrawn from him, but it was not their intention to do so. The government wanted to keep him as a Conservative MP and to ride this one out. And I think it's that culture, just as much as the processes and the systems, that needs to change. Because if the people at the very top, the people with the power, because there's such a power imbalance in sexual abuse, which makes the abusers think they can get away with it and means victims feel they can't come forwards. But if you've got the people at the very top of government seeking to ride this one out, then I'm afraid we have a situation where our standards in public life are further trashed, where victims won't want to come forwards, and where people who are seeking to get away with things that are utterly unacceptable will feel more able to do stuff which is reprehensible. And that's why, it's not just about processes and bits of paper and forms that we need to get right, although those do need to happen. It's about setting those standards that the country can see to restore trust in our politics that I'm afraid has been so severely damaged over the past few years, in particular by the actions of the Prime Minister, but not just him alone. And that's why it's not just about swapping one person out here. It's about saying this system is broken. It needs to change.
Do you think those MPs who have been suspended, who've been investigated, who've in some cases been found guilty of misconduct, or who are still at some point in that process, who've had allegations made, does the system break them, or do they enter Parliament already broken and already susceptible to this sort of misconduct, or are they victims of the system?
Oh, that's a very good question. I think, the sole responsibility for sexual assault is on the perpetrator.
Sure.
And there are many attempts to kind of excuse it in the Westminster system. And, there are things that you can look at as to see how can the workplace be made safer? So how can Westminster's alcohol-fueled nighttime culture be addressed? That's clearly something that is within the remit of Parliament to take action on. But actually, what we've got in Westminster is that power imbalance that I said earlier, where people feel that they are untouchable, where they can do things that in any other walk of life, in any other workplace would be unacceptable and would see them booted out immediately, somehow excused or protected. And it's that type of culture that we are seeing. So, there's been a big difference in the treatment of Neil Parish, who watched pornography in the House of Commons, a Conservative MP who stood down as a member of Parliament, and what we saw from Downing Street with Chris Pincher over the last few hours. There was a swift response for Neil Parish in removing the whip, but a really slow response from the government in removing the whip from their arch loyalist and their deputy chief whip. And you've got to ask yourself, why is that the case? Because clearly allegedly sexually assaulting two men is considerably serious. It is something that should demand urgent action. But the attempt to ride it out, to kind of go, no, the matter's now closed, when it clearly wasn't, is something that I think we should be asking questions about, because it's the behaviour that creates the toxic culture. And the way to address it is through strong leadership that sets high standards. We don't have that from the Prime Minister at the moment.
It's worth mentioning, actually, we spoke to Neil Parish about half an hour ago on this programme, and if you'd like to listen back to that, you or indeed our other listeners, and you can scroll back in the Times Radio app. Let's go on then to consider, Mr Pollard, some of the other events of the week, which I know you'll be interested in as Shadow Minister for the Armed Forces. Indeed, interesting to reflect on Boris Johnson's, really quite good week diplomatically, one could argue. This sort of coalition of Western leaders, both at the G7 and at NATO, which resulted in Boris Johnson committing to increasing defence spending to 2.5% of GDP by the end of the decade. Do you buy into that idea of more money for the military?
I think given the circumstances that we face as a country with Russia's criminal invasion of Ukraine, Labour has said for many months that if the Conservative government looks again at defence spending, they'll have our full support. But it's not just about spending more money on our armed forces. It's about spending it wisely. And the government is still planning to cut 10,000 soldiers from our army over the next 3 years. By the time that we get to that commitment that by the end of the decade that you just mentioned, we will have lost 1 in 5 of our infantry from the armed forces, from an army of 100,000 when Labour left power to one of 73,000, with fewer of those being able to be deployable. Now, I don't think that's the right response to the emerging situation with Russia. I think the government needs to rethink defence spending and reboot its defence plans, which means looking again at their defence cuts. Now, as an MP for a naval city, I've been arguing quite strongly against the cuts to our armed forces and the Royal Navy in particular we've seen over the last decade. But when confronted with such aggression by Russia, I think it is necessary for us to look again at what is being proposed and how we are doing it. Now, I'd like to see a little bit more scrutiny on what is in a 2.5%. Of defence spending, because it looks like the government's rolling up aid to Ukraine and adding it in there. They're probably also adding the cost of renewing Britain's nuclear warheads into that situation, which probably would have meant the budget would raise to about 2.5% by the end of the decade, notwithstanding what's going on in Ukraine anyway. So I do think we need to look behind the headlines, but the direction of travel is one that I welcome. And I think that, in these uncertain times, I think most people would. But they've got to spend the money wisely. And when so much is wasted on defence procurements that are billions of pounds overspent, with poor outcomes for our armed forces and equipment such as the Ajax programme, the new armoured fighting vehicle for the army that they can't use, that's making our soldiers go deaf because of the high noise and vibration in those vehicles. We've got to say, more money is not necessarily always the answer if it's spent poorly, although I do welcome the increase that has been signalled by government.
Mr. Pollard, Luke Pollard, thank you very much indeed for your time.